What the Arab slave trade did to African women was worse than death. When the history of human bondage is recounted, the Atlantic slave trade dominates the narrative. The Middle Passage, the plantations of the Caribbean, the cotton fields of the American South, these images are seared into global memory. But there exists a parallel, older, and in many ways more psychologically intricate system of enslavement that stretched for over 13 centuries, from the 7th century well into the 20th. This was the Arab slave trade, also known as the Trans-Saharan or East African slave trade. And within its brutal machinery, African women were subjected to a unique constellation of horrors that many survivors and witnesses described as a fate worse than physical death. To understand this statement is to abandon the notion that death represents the ultimate tragedy. For the women captured, marched, sold, and absorbed into the vast Islamic world, death would often have been a mercy. They were denied even that. They entered a realm where their bodies were rendered into perpetual, sanctioned commodities, their wombs into factories for more slaves, and their identities into shadows erased by concubinage, castration, and a theological legal framework that normalized their suffering. The geographical scale was staggering. The Arab slave trade funneled an estimated 17 million to 20 million African people out of the continent, a number roughly equivalent to the transatlantic trade. But while the Atlantic trade was driven by the need for brute labor on plantations and in mines, the Arab trade had a different appetite. It prized young women and children above all. Male slaves were worked to death in salt mines, on date plantations, or as eunuch guards. But female slaves, they were destined for a more intimate, protracted, and psychologically annihilating purpose. The trade route sprawled across the Sahara Desert, down the Nile, and across the Indian Ocean. From Zanzibar, the epicenter of the Eastern trade, slave caravans would stagger inland toward Lake Tanganyika and beyond. The Swahili coast became a human marketplace where the price of a woman was determined by the lightness of her skin, the fullness of her lips, the shape of her breasts, and her perceived virginity. These were not abstract economic transactions. They were the systematic reduction of millions of individual human souls into the category of milk, a term used for merchandise, for things. For the women captured, the nightmare began before the first shackle was closed. The capture, the shattering of the social web. Life in pre-colonial East and Central Africa was organized around kinship, clan, and lineage. A woman's identity was rooted in her role as a daughter, wife, mother, healer, or farmer within a known universe of relationships. The arrival of slave raiders from the north, often armed with firearms procured from Arab or Ottoman traders, dismantled this universe in a single violent dawn. The capture was a technology of terror. Unlike the Atlantic trade, which often involved African intermediaries selling prisoners of war in a relatively organized coastal system, the Arab trade reached deep inland. The infamous Tipu Tip, a Zanzibari trader of mixed Arab and African descent, led massive expeditions that depopulated entire regions of what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, Malawi, and Zambia. His methods were not unique. A typical raid on a village would begin hours before sunrise. The raiders, often composed of Swahili-speaking Arabs, Nyamwezi, or Yao auxiliaries, would encircle the settlement. At a signal, they would set the perimeter huts ablaze, creating a wall of fire and panic. As men, women, and children fled the flames, they were clubbed, speared, or shot. The objective was not to kill. It was to collect. Men of fighting age were often executed on the spot. They were too dangerous to march and too prone to rebellion. The elderly and the infirm were likewise murdered. The targets were children and young women. For a woman, the moment of capture was a double violation. She would watch her father or husband cut down. She would hear her children's screams as they were torn from her arms, often to be taken in a separate direction. She would feel the rough fiber rope around her neck, joining her in a human chain of perhaps 50 or 60 other weeping, bleeding captives. Then came the shackles. For the Atlantic trade, the iconic image is the iron neck collar connected by a chain. For the Arab trade, it was the shiringi, a forked wooden pole, its Y-shape clamped around a woman's neck, the sharp prongs often digging into her throat and jaw. The other end of the pole was tied to a rope, which was tied to a donkey or to the waist of another captive. If one stumbled, she would choke the person ahead. If she fell, she would be dragged until her neck snapped or her windpipe crushed. The forced march across the savannah or desert could last 3 to 6 months. Consider the geography. From the interior of Tanzania to the coast at Bagamoyo or Kilwa, a distance of some 500 miles. Or from the Kingdom of Congo across the Sahara to Morocco, over 1,500 miles of arid hell. During these marches, the women were given a single handful of millet or sorghum per day, if that. Water was rationed in lizard skins or calabashes. The nights were spent in bomas, thorn-enclosed camps where the women were bound and laid on the bare earth. It was in these camps that the first systematic sexual violence occurred. The slave caravan leaders, the Jambazi and their Nyampra overseers, did not see these women as human. They were cargo. And cargo could be used. Rape was not an act of passion or deviance. It was an act of domination and a method of breaking the spirit. A woman who resisted was beaten with a kiboko, a hippopotamus hide whip that flayed skin from bone in a single stroke. But the true horror was reserved for the women who were considered exceptionally beautiful or who attempted to escape. For them, there was the kuni, a heavy log bound to the ankle by an iron chain. Imagine trying to walk for 800 miles with a 40-pound log chain to your leg, the wood chafing your ankle raw, the chain cutting to the bone, the wound festering with flies and sand. Many women did not survive the march. Their bodies were left by the trail, their logs still attached, their bones bleaching under the African sun. The sorting, the Zanzibar market and the anatomy of degradation. The destination for most was the island of Zanzibar, specifically its slave market at Stone Town. Here, at the Mkunazini, the place where the rope is tied, the women who survived the march would face the final stripping of their humanity. The process was designed to be exhaustive, invasive, and public. Upon arrival, the captives were herded into a stone enclosure, washed, and their wounds superficially treated, not out of kindness, but to improve the price. Then came the sorting. Women and girls as young as 8 were separated from boys and from the few surviving adult males. The men would be sent to the clove plantations on the island or to the date groves of Oman. The women were led to a raised platform, the Duka la Watumwa, the slave shop. Here, a prospective buyer, an Omani merchant, a Hadrami Sayyid, a wealthy Swahili trader, or the agent of a Turkish pasha, would conduct his inspection. This was not a discreet affair. It was a public ritual of degradation. The woman would be made to walk back and forth so the buyer could assess her gait, her posture, her physical symmetry. She was ordered to open her mouth to examine her teeth, a crude indicator of age and general health. Her hands were inspected for calluses, rough hands indicated a field worker, smooth hands suggested domestic potential. Then came the physical examination of her body. The buyer would run his hands over her arms, her back, her legs. He would feel her breasts to gauge their firmness and size. And then, the ultimate indignity, the inspection of her genitalia. She was forced to lie on her back while the buyer or his agent parted her legs and visually and manually examined her vagina. For a virgin, the hymen was a guarantee of higher value. The buyer would insert his fingers to check for any malformation, disease, or evidence of previous childbirth. This was done in full view of other traders, of strangers, of other captive women waiting their turn. There was no privacy. There was no consent. There was only the transaction. The terminology used in the market reveals the mindset. A jaria was a female slave, but she was further categorized. A bukra was a young virgin. An askari was a female guard or soldier, a rare category. A mukataba was a woman attempting to buy her freedom via a contract. But the most significant category, the one that defined the fate of most, was Suriya, a concubine. This was not a casual term. In Islamic law of the era classical Maliki, Shafi'i, and Hanafi schools, a man was permitted unlimited concubines from among his female slaves, in addition to his 4 wives. The children of a Suriya were free and legitimate, inheriting from the father. This legal provision created a monstrous incentive. It meant that the enslaved woman's womb became a capital asset. Her fertility was not merely exploited, it was the primary source of her owner's future wealth and lineage. Compare this to the Atlantic slave trade. In the Americas, an enslaved woman's children were also slaves, chattel property that increased the owner's wealth. But in the Arab system, the children of a concubine were free. This might sound, on the surface, like a path to liberation. In reality, it was a psychological weapon of unimaginable precision. Because it meant that the only way a woman could achieve any semblance of status or security for her child was to submit completely, to please her master absolutely, to compete with other concubines and wives for his favor. Her body was not just a site of labor or rape, it was a battlefield for dynastic politics within the household. She was both the slave and the potential mother of a free Arab. That contradiction tore her apart. The concubine's existence, the gilded cage of the harem. The word harem conjures, in the Western imagination, images of opulence, silk cushions, fountains, perfumed gardens, and the sensual pleasures of 1001 nights. The reality for the vast majority of enslaved African women in the Arab world was closer to a prison painted with gold leaf. The concubine's life was defined by 3 pressures: sexual availability, reproductive output, and social invisibility. First, sexual availability. A Suriya was expected to be available to her master at any time, day or night. She had no right to refuse. This was not marriage, it was ownership. She could be loaned to guests, given as a gift, or sold at any moment. In the courts of the Ottoman sultans, in the palaces of Moroccan emperors, and in the stone houses of Omani merchants, these women existed in a state of perpetual, coerced intimacy. Many masters were not cruel in the overt sense. They did not beat their concubines. They did not need to. The structural violence of the institution was sufficient. A woman who was uncooperative could be demoted to a menial laborer, sent to the stables or the kitchens, or resold to a lower-tier owner who might work her to death in a quarry. Compliance was survival. Second, reproductive pressure. The concubine's value rose dramatically if she bore a child, especially a son. A mother of a free son could not be sold, and upon her master's death, she would be automatically freed. This was the only legal path out of slavery for most women. And so, the system weaponized the most primal human instinct, a mother's love for her child. Women prayed for pregnancy, even as they were raped. They endured repeated miscarriages from malnutrition, disease, and the physical toll of sexual servitude. When a child was born, it was immediately claimed by the father's family. The child would be raised as a free Muslim, often with no knowledge of his mother's language, culture, or history. The mother would be permitted to nurse the child, but she was not the mother in a social or legal sense. She was the vessel. She would watch her son call another woman grandmother. She would hear him speak Arabic or Turkish, not her native Swahili or Yao. She would see him dressed in fine silks while she wore rough cotton. Her child would grow up to own slaves himself, perhaps even a girl from her own village. This was not liberation. This was a form of living death, where your own offspring became a stranger, a member of the master class. Third, social invisibility. The concubine existed in a zone of non-personhood. She was not a wife, She could not inherit, could not testify in court against a free person, and could not leave the house without permission. She was not a servant. Servants were free and could quit. She was property. Her name was often changed to an Arabic one, erasing her last link to her past. She was forbidden from practicing her own spiritual traditions, forced to adopt the outward forms of Islam. Her emotions were irrelevant. A famous Arab proverb from the era states, "The slave's tears are water, the slave's words are wind." She could cry for 1,000 nights, no one would listen. Yet, some might ask, was this not better than the field slave of the American South? The comparison is false, but for the sake of argument, consider the psychological dimensions. The enslaved woman in Mississippi knew her enemy. It was the white planter, the overseer, the legal code that defined her as chattel. She could resist, run away, join a maroon community, or hold on to the hope of the Underground Railroad. Her children were her children, even if they could be sold away. The enslaved concubine in Cairo or Muscat faced a more insidious enemy. Her enemy was intimacy. Her enemy was the man who fathered her children, who bought her dresses, who held her at night and then sold her niece in the morning. Her enemy was her own child, who would one day look down on her. Her resistance was impossible because any act of defiance could separate her from her child permanently. The system did not need chains. It needed her hope. The eunuch and the castration of the female soul, beyond the concubine. Not all African women in the slave trade became concubines. A darker fate awaited a smaller, but significant, number. This was the fate of the Khadim, the female eunuch. While male castration is well documented in the Arab slave trade, the infamous Coptic monks of Upper Egypt who performed the brutal operation, female castration is less discussed, but no less horrific. It took two forms. The first was the removal of the ovaries and sometimes the clitoris through an operation known as istibra. This was performed on women destined to be guardians of the harems of the extremely wealthy, the sultans, the viziers, the wealthiest merchants. These women, often Abyssinian or Nubian, were selected for their height and physical strength. The operation, performed without anesthesia using a red-hot iron or a sharpened bamboo knife, was intended to eliminate sexual desire and prevent pregnancy. The mortality rate was staggering, perhaps 70% died of infection or hemorrhage. Those who survived were rendered sterile and often suffered from chronic pain, hormonal disorders, and psychological trauma. They became the enforcers of the system, the Agas of the female world, guarding other enslaved women, punishing disobedience, and ensuring the master's property remained intact. They were both victim and perpetrator, a tragic irony forced upon them by the blade. The second form was mass clitoridectomy and infibulation, what is now called female genital mutilation. While FGM has pre-Islamic roots in some African cultures, the Arab slave trade dramatically expanded and systematized its practice. Female slaves destined for the brothels of Cairo, Damascus, or Baghdad were often subjected to khitan al-banat, the circumcision of girls. The stated purpose was to ensure chastity and control sexual appetite. The actual purpose was to increase the woman's price in markets where pure and controlled slaves were valued. The procedure involved cutting off the clitoris and the labia minora, then stitching the labia majora together, leaving only a small opening for urine and menstrual blood. This was done to girls as young as 6 or 7. They were held down by older women while a midwife wielded a razor or a piece of broken glass. The pain was indescribable. The complications, infection, hemorrhage, chronic urinary tract infections, painful intercourse, obstructed childbirth, lasted a lifetime. And for the enslaved woman, this mutilation was not a cultural rite of passage, it was a commercial alteration, performed by strangers who saw her as a product to be improved. The Saharan route, the salt and the silence. While the eastern route through Zanzibar is better documented, the trans-Saharan route into Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya was equally devastating for women. The Sahara was a sea of sand and stone, and the caravans that crossed it were floating cities of misery. The slave market at Timbuktu, the legendary city of gold, also dealt in flesh. From there, women were marched north to the salt mines of Tagaza or across the Tenner Desert to Ghadames and Tripoli. The Saharan crossing was a gauntlet of thirst. A single caravan could include 1,000 women. Water was carried in goatskins, which often burst or evaporated. The almajir, the water slave, was a role assigned to young women who were forced to run ahead of the caravan to find oases or wells. If they found water, they lived. If they did not, they were left to die. The sandstorms were another horror. A ghibli could bury a woman in seconds, her mouth and nose filling with fine, burning dust. Women would tie their veils around their faces, but many suffocated, their bodies desiccated into natural mummies by the dry air. On this route, the sexual violence took a different form. With no colonial authorities, no Ottoman officials, and no law except the whip of the caravan leader, women were subjected to what survivors called Laylat al-Rozas, the night of lead. This referred to the lead seals placed on the vulvas of young virgin slaves to ensure their purity until they reached the northern markets. The seal was a strip of lead with a wire, crimped shut. To break it was to reduce the price. And so, the caravan guards, desperate and isolated for months, would rape the older women, the married women, the women past their first youth. They would save the sealed virgins. But they would make the other women watch. They would make the mothers watch as their daughters were sealed, knowing what awaited them in the north. The psychological splitting, of protecting one's virgin daughter from rape by raping the mother instead, was a calculated atrocity. The diaspora of wombs, the Indian Ocean and the Gulf. The reach of the Arab slave trade extended far beyond Africa and the Middle East. From the Swahili coast, dhows, sailing vessels with triangular lateen sails, carried enslaved women across the Indian Ocean to Persia, India, the Maldives, and as far as Java and the Spice Islands. This was the maritime equivalent of the trans-Saharan route, and it had its own particular horrors. The dhow journey could take weeks or months, depending on the monsoon winds. Women were packed into the holds below deck, which were barely 5 feet high. They could not stand. They lay in their own excrement and vomit. The dhow captains, the nakodas, believed that sea air caused illness, so the hatches were battened down. Women suffocated, died of dysentery, or went mad from the darkness and the rolling of the ship. Sharks followed the dhows, attracted by the bodies thrown overboard. But the true destination for many was the harem system of the Mughal Empire in India, the princely states of the Deccan, and the royal courts of Asa in Sumatra. Here, African women, known as Habshi or Sidi, were prized for their perceived loyalty and physical strength. Unlike the Arab world, where concubines could achieve freedom through childbearing, in South Asia, the status of African slave women was often lower. They were used as bodyguards, as wet nurses, and as entertainers, dancers and singers. The Devadasi system, which involved dedicating women to temples for ritualized sexual servitude, absorbed many African women. They became the property of the temple, not of a single man, and were passed among priests and patrons. Their children, if they were permitted to live, became temple slaves in turn. This was a multi-generational curse. In the Persian Gulf, in Muscat, Bandar Abbas, and Bushehr, African women were used in the pearl diving industry. While men dove for pearls, women were the nakodas of the shore. Camps. They cleaned and sorted the oysters, and they were the sexual property of the diving masters. The conditions in the Gulf were extreme, heat that exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit, brackish water, and the constant threat of malaria. The women who worked there had a life expectancy of perhaps 5 years after capture. The theological wound, how Islamic law enabled the sisters. To understand why this system persisted for over a millennium, one must examine the theological legal framework that underpinned it. Classical Islamic jurisprudence, derived from the Quran and Hadith, did not invent slavery. It inherited and regulated existing practices. But the specific regulations created loopholes large enough to drive a slave caravan through. The Quran acknowledges slavery as a fact of life. It encourages the freeing of slaves as an act of piety but does not abolish the institution. Crucially, it gives explicit permission for men to have sexual relations with their female slaves. Surah 23, verses 5-6, "And they who guard their private parts, except from their wives or those their right hands possess, i.e., concubines, for indeed, they are not to be blamed." This single verse, interpreted by the consensus of classical scholars, placed the enslaved woman's body outside the category of adultery, fornication, or sin. Rape, within the context of ownership, was not legally rape. It was istimta, lawful enjoyment. Furthermore, the legal doctrine of milk al-yamin, what the right hand possesses, created a property right so absolute that it overrode nearly all other considerations. A master could not kill his slave, that was prohibited. But he could beat, starve, confine, and sexually use his slave with impunity, provided he did not cause permanent injury or death. The slave's testimony was inadmissible in court against a free person. A slave could not own property, marry without permission, or refuse sexual advances. The istibra, the waiting period to determine if a captured woman was pregnant, reveals the system's cold logic. When a woman was captured, she was isolated for one menstrual cycle. If she was not pregnant, she was available for immediate sale and use. If she was pregnant, the child belonged to the master of her previous owner. This was not about protecting the woman, it was about protecting property rights over the fetus. The woman was an incubator whose womb's contents were subject to contract law. Even the so-called progressive elements of the system were perverse. The rule that a concubine who bore her master's child walad could not be sold and would be freed upon his death seems humane. But in practice, it led masters to repeatedly impregnate concubines, then ignore them for a decade while they raised the free children. A woman with 2 or 3 children by her master was still a slave. She was still subject to his whims. She still could not leave. Her freedom was a future promise, deferred until the master's death, and if he lived 50 years, so did her bondage. Some masters, to avoid the automatic freeing of a favored concubine, would sell her before she bore a child, or would simply refuse to acknowledge paternity. Resistance, the unquenchable fire. It would be a grave error to portray African women in the slave trade as passive victims. Their resistance took many forms, from the spectacular to the silent, from the suicidal to the subversive. The most dramatic resistance was rebellion. On slave caravans, women sometimes used their few advantages. Because they were less heavily chained than men, the iron shackles were reserved for adult males. Women could coordinate escapes. There are documented accounts from the 1860s of a group of Nyamwezi women on a caravan near Tabora who, during a night raid by a rival tribe, used the confusion to strangle their guard with his own turban and flee into the bush. They knew they would be hunted. They knew recapture meant death or mutilation. They ran anyway. Many were recaptured, but some reached the safety of a mission station or a rival chiefdom. Another form was infanticide by neglect. Some women, having given birth to a master's child, would refuse to nurse it. They would let the infant starve, knowing that the master might kill them in rage, but also knowing that the child, if it lived, would be raised to own slaves. This was an act of terrible agency, a choice to end a life rather than bring a free oppressor into the world. Christian missionaries in Zanzibar in the 1870s recorded cases of enslaved women weeping over dead infants, whispering in their native tongue, "Better the grave than the harem." A third form was cultural subversion. In the harems of Istanbul and Cairo, enslaved African women secretly preserved their languages. They would speak Swahili or Hausa to each other when the master or his wives were present, creating a private code. They would sing their village songs under their breath while grinding grain. They would tell their children, the free sons and daughters of the master, stories of the great kingdoms of Congo or Zimbabwe, planting seeds of African identity in the minds of the next generation of the ruling class. This was not rebellion with a spear. It was rebellion with a lullaby. There were also documented cases of legal resistance. A few concubines, particularly in 19th century Egypt and the Ottoman Empire, managed to petition a Qadi judge for manumission on technical grounds. For example, if they could prove their master had promised them freedom in a moment of drunkenness, or if they could produce a witness to an illegal sale. These cases were rare, and the women who brought them risked severe punishment. But they exist in the court records of Cairo and Damascus, proof that even in the depths of enslavement, the human spirit sought justice. Perhaps the most poignant resistance was suicide. For many women, death was the only remaining freedom. The Nile, the Tigris, the well in the courtyard, these became escape routes. A 17th-century Ottoman chronicler in Baghdad noted with disgust the stubbornness of Abyssinian slave women who would throw themselves into the river at night. He called it a waste of good property. He could not understand that for those women, the cold water was not death. It was a return to the arms of a mother they would never see again. It was a flight from a body that had been turned into a marketplace. It was an assertion of the one right the system could not take away, the right to stop existing. The scars on the present, the legacy of the trade. The Arab slave trade officially ended in the 20th century through a combination of European colonial pressure, Britain's anti-slavery squadron in the Indian Ocean after 1873, internal abolitionist movements within the Islamic world, and the economic changes brought by the end of the clove and date plantation systems. But ended is a legal term, not a human one. The legacy of what was done to African women persists in three profound ways. First, the demographic and social scar. The removal of an estimated 10 million women from sub-Saharan Africa over 13 centuries skewed the gender ratios of entire regions. In parts of Tanzania, Mozambique, and Sudan, there are still villages where the oral tradition speaks of the years the women disappeared. The trade targeted women of childbearing age, which means it depressed birth rates for generations. This is a demographic wound that never fully healed. Second, the psychological scar across the diaspora. The descendants of enslaved African women in the Arab world, the Al-Aqdam in Yemen, the Sidi in Pakistan, the Nawawa in Morocco, remain marginalized castes. In Yemen, the Al-Aqdam, literally the servants, live in segregated slums, work as street sweepers and beggars, and are forbidden from intermarrying with pure Yemenis. Their skin color marks them. Their history as the children of concubines and slaves is used to deny them dignity. The shame of the mother has been inherited by the child, centuries later. The womb that was supposed to produce free children produced a permanent underclass. Third, the ongoing practice of slavery and FGM. While the classical Arab slave trade is over, human trafficking for sexual exploitation continues in the Gulf states, in Lebanon, in Libya. African women are still brought as domestic workers under the kafala system, which gives their employers near absolute control over their passports, movement, and bodies. Human rights organizations have documented cases of rape, torture, and wage theft that mirror the Jariya system. Female genital mutilation, systematized by the slave trade, continues to be practiced in Egypt, Sudan, Somalia, and Yemen, often defended as an Islamic tradition, though it predates Islam and is not required by the Quran. The blade that cut the flesh of slave girls now cuts the flesh of free girls, in the name of purity and control. The ghost of the market at Zanzibar haunts the clinics of Cairo. Worse than death, a philosophical conclusion. We return to the central claim: what was done to African women in the Arab slave trade was worse than death. Is this hyperbole? Or is it an accurate moral assessment? Death is singular. It is an event. It ends suffering. It closes the book. The fate of the enslaved woman was not singular. It was 1,000 small deaths, repeated daily for decades. The death of her name when the trader renamed her Aisha or Fatima. The death of her language when she was beaten for speaking her mother tongue. The death of her motherhood when her child was taken to be raised by strangers. The death of her body when the iron entered her flesh. The death of her sexuality when she was mutilated. The death of her hope when she realized that even freedom would leave her stranded in a land not her own. And finally, the death of her memory when she was buried in an unmarked grave, her story unsung, her suffering unrecorded except in the ledgers of slave merchants who listed her as one female, light complexion, good teeth, price 400 dirhams. The Atlantic slave trade killed millions through overwork, disease, and violence. That was a genocide of the body. The Arab slave trade, for women, committed a genocide of the soul. It did not just work them to death. It worked them into a state of living where death became a friend they were not permitted to meet. The poet and survivor of the trade, a woman known only as Maryam bint Siddiqui, was recorded in 1890 by a German missionary in Zanzibar. She was asked if she wanted to return to her village in the interior. She was old, blind, and her children were long dead or lost. She replied in halting Arabic, "To where? My village is under the sand. My children are in the bellies of sharks. My name is on a paper in a house I have never seen. I am not a woman. I am a wound that learned to talk." That is what the Arab slave trade did to African women. It turned them into wounds that talked. And those wounds have not stopped talking. They speak in the silence of the Yemeni slum, in the cut flesh of the Sudanese girl, in the eyes of the trafficked Nigerian woman in Beirut. The trade is over. The atrocity is not. It lives in the body of every African woman who is told that her body is not her own. And that, more than any gallows or grave, is worse than death.